The more that I understood where I was critical about my own identity and kind of understanding where that came from, and then actually understanding that that was external and that was cultural because of growing up in the West, understanding that at the same time as just being just generally more critical of the things that I was consuming. I think that just in combination was like, oh, holy shit. Right. Wait, and then I think, because, like I said, I continue to have conversations with my own family about, their lived experiences in China.
Hi, this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. I'm Ileana Chan, and I'm here with community organizer, Scottish, Chinese person, Saorsa.
Hi, Ileana.
Hi. So today we're going to be discussing, I think, a lot of the reports coming out of China. We're not going to specifically be discussing the reports, but we're going to be discussing the dynamics of it and how we, as Chinese, British, you're Scottish, I'm British, Malaysian, whatever, wherever I'm from, how we're sort of like digesting the news, how we're sort of, navigating through the propaganda and stuff like that. Absolutely. So, yeah, and actually this conversation sort of came about because you made a really good point in one of our previous conversations, I suppose, about your own Sinophobia and how you've evolved your thinking about China. And I realized, like, I have maybe not the same evolution, we'll see, but I have an evolution too from how I think about China and what I think about China now, etc.
Yeah, and I think also on the evolution part, I think some of it is internal, just through reassessing what we're shown and seen. So not just necessarily related to China, right, but just I think overall noticing how Western media has portrayed and talked about lots of different issues, domestic issues, right? Say, for example, like Black Lives Matter, political things that are happening in the West. And then also then seeing how that has been applied to the reporting on China. And I think also for me, this is really important to talk about because I think that the rise in anti-China propaganda and xenophobia in our media has actually grown exponentially at quite an alarming rate. Whereas, I think previously you would see a few negative headlines about China, whereas I think now every reporting that comes out has a very, I would say, aggressive anti-China bent. And obviously this is incredibly relevant and I think for us, maybe mostly relevant for Chinese people, or, probably affects all East and Southeast Asian people as well. Anyone that can look Chinese, essentially. And it
also, but it also really affects anyone who maybe doesn't like war or death or destruction.
Yeah, and I just think in the wake of COVID as well, it's even more hyper relevant, right? Like you have this. On the face of it, you have, Western governments saying that, yes, we hate racism and, we should be anti-racist. And, it's a problem, all this Asian hate crimes. But then on the other side of it, their foreign policy is actually incredibly aggressive and anti-China in a political way.
Yeah, I think you can really see from the AUKUS, what a lovely name, sort of, what would you say, rollout, I would say, presentation of the AUKUS, what is it, an alliance? They're calling it a defense security pact. But where's the threat? And I suppose the implicit threat with AUKUS is China's the threat, right? And so it's the way that they're sort of covering that, I think, has made it way more, I'm not sure if I'm more aware or they're just being so much more blatant about it.
I think it's probably a little bit of both. Yeah.
A little both. That 60-minute Australian warmongering thing about China, I think in the first 60 seconds already, they're like basically drumming up the war drums.
War with China. It sounds unthinkable, but according to many experts, the countdown may be on. China's President Xi Jinping is shaping up to the West like never before. And just last week, a major new military alliance was announced between the US, Australia and the UK to counter Chinese aggression in the Pacific.
The way that they're framing China as a threat is so scary in that, and yet they can't even point to one concrete example of China's instigation or escalation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to recognize because I think we're much younger, obviously, when the Iraq War situation was brewing, and they were laying the foundation for that invasion. And I think we saw as well at that time, right, the media really ramping up Islamophobia, and really setting the course. And I think that I think it's important to make comparisons, and I think it's important to draw parallels where they're relevant. I hope we probably won't get into kind of whataboutism, right? Because I don't think we need to do that. But I think there are important parallels, and just like calling out kind of, I think, the hypocrisy as well in the way that the media and the governments are approaching these issues or talking about these issues. So it's more about, I think, what we can try and do is like recognize where those are coming from and recognize it when we see it, so that we can be objective, or as objective as we can, about our thinking about these issues. And then also, just I think challenging the mindset that we need to be interventionist in order to care about other countries, or things that are happening in other areas. So I think it's more about as well, once you have tried to understand where the issues are, how do we show acts of solidarity versus going in there and making changes.
I mean, I think that that's something that we have to acknowledge, is while some people may actually have genuinely good intentions, there is no case of invasion in my lifetime, or maybe I'm just completely ignorant to it, and I doubt that would be the case, because if there was a case of a single invasion interventionalist project by the US or the UK that actually did good for that country, we would know about it. We would definitely know about it. That would not be a secret, right? That would be something that they would be telling us over and over again, and yet they haven't. So when people think of, because I've heard, for example, in Ethiopia, people wanting some people saying that they want foreign interference. But I'm just like, in what case has that ever been the reason that the US or the UK would invade a country anyway, and actually has had an effect of something good?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because there's two things that immediately come to mind. One is I came across this article, this opinion piece in the New York Times, actually. I think that was written back in 2002 or 2003, and it essentially tried to argue that military intervention is a more effective humanitarian effort than actual humanitarian efforts on the ground. And I think it's interesting because we are often presented with a false dichotomy or a false choice, a binary choice, whether that is our political action or like our identity. Actually, it's always this messaging of it's either war or we let evil people be evil. And I think it's also interesting as well when people situation last year, 2 years ago, in Brazil and Venezuela, people will, in Cuba even, right, people will call upon the fact that the people are quite rightly desperate for change, desperate for basically an ability to live their lives properly, and then again creating this false dichotomy or this false choice of, well, the only way that we can help them or support them is through intervention, through sanctions or through military intervention or through some sort of forceful violence. And that is just simply not true. And And I think it's also might be interesting to point out as well, like this is what happens when we talk about domestic policy as well, right? So for example, if we talk about violence in marginalized communities, the answer is often, well, especially in the US, right? Well, the Black community wants more police in their neighborhoods. And it's like, well, actually, if you ask those community members what they actually want, they want safety, they want security, they want resources available so that they can actually mitigate violence on their own, but they're not presented with those, right? The government has never offered those options. So in the face of nothing from the government, of course, they're going to say, well, I want something. And if that one thing is police, then give me that, And I think that's been shown to, if you actually ask them nuanced questions, they will give you nuanced answers and nuanced solutions. But if your question is only, do you want us to do nothing or do you want us to intervene?
Right. Yeah.
Then how is that a real question? How is that a real choice? So yeah, I think it's quite easy to hang your hat on that option if that's the only one that's available. But yeah, I think most people maybe don't think much further than, well, is that the only choice? And is that the right choice?
Well, also if it's presented in this way of like, we're going to come in to save you, and that's the only choice we're giving you. Yeah, but the truth is it's not ever that way, right? They're not coming in to save you. And also just the idea of, I think the other thing too is that humanitarian aid thing has been so, well, I guess maybe all the time, but I just was not aware of it before. Just has been corrupted in such a way that it's hard to also trust. Humanitarian aid.
And I think this is part of the larger context, right, that we have in terms of how the West perceives itself in relation to the global South. And this is part of everything we're talking about has obviously a larger geopolitical context. It has historical context. It has so much, cultural context as well. It's not necessarily based on our own interpretation or how we perceive things, but I think part of that is also our ability to really decolonize our minds and our mindset, right? Because I think there are many people in the West who have the capacity and the interest in kind of these geopolitical issues that are happening abroad, but the initial instinct is always to go and save them or to donate to charity, right? Whereas I think that what needs to happen and what we need to start pivoting towards is how do we enable and how do we support people on the ground in those countries, in those regions that are already doing the work of trying to gain a legitimacy themselves, right? Or trying to gain collective power themselves. And so I think our best efforts are in amplifying those people that are already doing the work versus any sort of intervention or any sort of coming in, swooping in. And I think that mindset really, really needs to change. But yeah, I think that will take time.
The savior, the Western savior trope. So kind of in trying to arm myself with knowledge or whatever, I'm trying to do more research on China because of, like we were talking about, our own maybe biases or prejudices, etc. But one of the things that I read is that poverty alleviation report by Tricontinental. And I think what's kind of fascinating about the report is just the very, very different mindset of Chinese people, of the Chinese in China, not just ethnic Chinese people. One of the things you said there then was, how do we help the people in these countries, right? How do we help people in other countries, like say, and it makes, this report makes a really interesting distinction that rather than depend on like NGOs or charitable groups that I think in the West we do tend to, very much so, especially in the US and I'm sure in the UK as well. There's a huge emphasis on whatever the government is not covering, all these like charitable foundations sort of have to fill in the gaps for that. And in China, it's kind of the opposite mentality.
Yeah.
So that's like, yeah.
Yeah. And I personally don't believe that the state is the solution to society's problems. That's a whole different topic, right? About, what do borders and what do states actually do for its own people? And, I have lots of questions about the legitimacy of, saying that, we need states to exist and we need them to provide these services. But I think in the current reality, right, states do exist, and there's material changes that can be made, or there's at least things that the states can focus on to actually improve the lives of its citizens, that most states are just not doing anyway. So I think that there's that part. I'm definitely not wholesale endorsing, right, that you relieve the state. The other part of that too is, and I think people will often, and again, this is part of decolonializing our minds and kind of rethinking what help and support actually means, right? Because if you think about philanthropy, if you think about non-government organizations, right? So those definitely started, or at least in the US, and I think in the UK too, have quite radical roots to begin with, right? Because they were addressing the needs of marginalized people, underserved people that weren't being addressed by the government and the state. So that's how they started. But there is often this kind of veil around the fact that it's not really a solution, right? So if you think about the funding that charities and NGOs receive, it's at the behest of wealthy individuals or special interest groups or governments, right, that are giving them this funding. So they have to actually think about, because they're beholden to their funders, they have to think about what their interests are and where they're focused on. Right. And if we're talking
about,
not
all of them are completely legitimate too. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah. So we're talking about such a huge range of different organizations, and like you're saying, they're funded for different reasons, etc. And also, I mean, some of them, their aims would be to even bring the issue to the public forefront and to change law. So it's kind of like, you know what I mean? There's a sort of an intersection with that as well. It's a huge, and someone say industry as well. It
is an industry, yeah.
Yeah. So
because if you also think about, if we believe, right, there are universal basic human rights, right, shelter, education, food, healthcare. If we believe that those are universal, then why are they being advanced based on the interests of specific individuals or organizations with the funding to provide those, right? If we believe they're universal, then they should be available universally, not because someone is interested in providing that to people.
So would you say that that's where you would like, if we believe they're universal, therefore the state or our governments, that should be part of our
exactly. In the current system that we have set up, right? If we want to believe that the purpose of the government is to help its citizens thrive and be functioning, then absolutely, right? If those are universal, then they should be provided by the state. But I don't think in an ideal world that is necessarily the right approach.
But it also brings me to the other point of it, was like reading that poverty alleviation report and seeing how China is looking at poverty, like sort of like holistically, was really, first of all, it was really eye-opening, because they really do cover a lot of different things. Like, but it, and I kind of want to get into what those things are. But I would say that being part of the West, being born here and everything, and having like a very skeptical view of our governments and what they can do, and politicians, I think that was like the biggest difference, was that I'm not sure if there is that trust here. Like, I don't feel this amazing trust from my government to get things done, for the good of our people. Yeah, for a good reason. So that's what really struck me about that report, was that the poverty alleviation system or program really had to be done with the cooperation of the people. The people had to believe in the project and in their government in order to do that, because people were being sent to like extremely poor areas as officials to help different communities, and had to live in like particularly difficult environments themselves. So it is like a level, which is not to say that people don't do that in the West, but I'm just saying, like, there's a level of trust there and cooperation.
I think, I think it's easier to achieve wide-scale change if you have a very centralized source of power who gets to make all of the policy decisions. And whether the citizens agree to it or not, it's very easy for them to roll these things out, right? There's no forum for people to disagree or to say that actually they don't want this to happen. So I think, and I think part of that is also, right, when they see the results of these programs, then clearly poverty, as you say, has been alleviated to a massive degree in comparison to, I think, any other country in recent history. So yeah, the results are there, which obviously reinforces the idea for the people, right, that the government is doing the right thing. But I think it's difficult to say how on board people are when they don't really have a choice.
Well, that was interesting was that there was this talk that I was listening to by Vijay Prashad, you know him, right? Mm-hmm. In I think the People's Forum in New York. Mm-hmm. And he did talk about like how certain Chinese intellectuals talked about China having like seven thought schools, mm-hmm. you know, and so again, he's sort of like bringing up the point, which I think part of my Sinophobia is like this idea of like, yeah, Chinese just don't have any say in anything. And so they just sort of follow along. Whereas like knowing that 1.4 billion people can't possibly agree on everything. So there are like factions of different thoughts and a sort of evolving, even when they come up, I think the difference is when they come up with a policy, it gets done, it gets implemented, and then, you know, but actually coming up with that policy has more discussion than maybe we're privy to outside. And I'm like really fascinated with how they sort of come up with their policies and their thinking, you know, when they must have disparate ideas as well.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of points that relate to Chinese culture, which I think that is not visible to Westerners. Even honestly, even Chinese people who grew up in the West or who were born in the West, they're not privy to how Chinese people actually think and act culturally. And you know, I came to the UK when I was 7. So I grew up a little bit in China. I have family there, obviously, and you know, I still feel culturally quite connected to China in some ways. So, and you know, I often have discussions with my own family members in China and my parents out here about Chinese culture and the perception of the government, because you know, and it is funny because I think the West tends to infantilize Chinese people, right? Like, oh yeah, they're obviously mindless, like, you know, they have no access to the internet. Well, it's like, well, no, Chinese people know how to access the internet. Young Chinese people do talk about politics. Young Chinese people do understand things that are going on. I think the example that people always like to use is, you know, how in China, like young people don't know about Tiananmen Square or like don't talk about it. It's like, well, they're not going to talk to a Western journalist about Tiananmen Square, like probably. Also, you're not entitled to know every single person's private opinions about, you know, something that happened in China.
It's so funny too. Like when I was studying, I studied Chinese in China for a year, and my Chinese is still terrible. However, I remember one of our Chinese teachers talking about Tiananmen Square, like not in a historical lesson way. Mm-hmm. She just talked about her own experience about that night or day, you know, sneaking out of a window, etc. Like it was really interesting to me that she was talking about that. I mean, openly, obviously, we were just like living there. It's not, we weren't journalists or anything. We weren't like some US official. So, but yeah, it is such a different mindset in the midst of it versus, like you're saying, the perception of it being like, it's just there's silence around it.
Exactly.
No one talks about it.
And you know, to also your point about people agreeing with the government or supporting the decisions that they make, right? And that also makes sense culturally as well. If you think about the type of poverty that China
Yes.
experienced, well up into the 80s for decades. I have personal family stories of like starvation and death and,
Right.
especially during the Cultural Revolution, like horrific like acts of like political violence as well. So coming up from that, and the government is saying, we're going to ensure that you don't starve, after 45 million people did starve in China over like a 10-year period or something. So yeah, if you have a government that says, I'm going to make sure that no one starves again, and we're going to create infrastructure. And again, it's not to say that at every point that they've done this perfectly, right? There's been a ton of corruption in Chinese governments, especially in rural areas, because it's such a massive country, right? It's not the same.
They're
The
still
same
human.
implementation, the same implementation doesn't happen in the cities as they do in very rural areas. So there was a massive crackdown in corruption across all levels in China, which hasn't ever happened in the West, I feel like. So yeah,
because then the Flint, if the Flint, the Flint executives, they would all be, well, I'm not executives, but yeah, they would all be maybe dead.
Right. Well, maybe at least made to some sort of level of accountability.
Yeah, some sort of level.
Welcome. Yeah, exactly. But and again, not to say anyone's endorsing the Chinese way of executing people for corruption. But yeah, if you tell the people, right, who have gone through trauma and starvation, to say, look, we're going to lift you out of poverty, and then they see the results of that, then of course people are going to be supportive of the government in some ways. But that's not to say that I think the majority of Chinese people will blindly defend the CCP at any given opportunity.
Right.
I don't think it's like that. But you can't tell a people who have made or who have experienced massive strides in their material conditions being improved that, oh, you're just a pawn of the state and you have no idea what's going on. I think this falls into the kind of the Western, I would say, government's way of telling us that they care about our material conditions, that they want to lift people out of poverty, versus the actual reality of that, which is it hasn't happened, right? The US operated under trickle down for decades.
Yeah, I mean, which is just that's been debunked, right, several times over.
Of course.
But I would even say that the US isn't even bothering anymore to put out that message of poverty alleviation the way like Xi Jinping did. Actually, I think it was 2019, his address, the New Year's address, where he was like, in 2020 we will eradicate poverty. I think it was 2019 or 2018.
And a lot of Chinese citizens like this mindset, like this, I think the government policy, which has been affectionately shorthandedly discussed among Chinese citizens, as we'll get you out of poverty first, we'll worry about human rights later. And there's obviously appeal of that kind of like thinking, right? Like, yes, the most urgent thing is poverty. I don't know if citizens really care about like political prisoners or people disappearing because of political reasons, or even famous people disappearing because of tax evasion or things like that.
Right. Yeah.
What is materially important to you?
Funding thing. But yes, exactly. But that does, I mean, and I think that it's very hard for us to know outside what is the scope of political prisoners, etc. But it does sort of make it, because I've been thinking about this a lot, because sometimes when you do talk about China, and it's again this Western imperialist mindset, sort of like where we look at other countries and think, oh, we know better, let's figure out how to fix that country. So we do tend to be like, well, China doesn't have human rights, it doesn't have this, or it doesn't have that, it doesn't have freedom of speech. But there's a lot of people in our countries that don't know, for example, about our political prisoners, the fact that, like, I think it was Trump, I think, that drones struck 2 Americans, killed them outright. So it's like, because they were apparently family members of like a terrorist or something like that. But the fact that that can happen in the US, that can happen in the UK, it's not, we don't know that much about it. It's not really covered by the media, etc. I can imagine someone in China, a similar thing could also be the case. You might not know about those things either because you're thinking about different aspects of your life.
Yeah, and the CCP don't exactly make it clear.
Yeah, neither does the
when
US
these things happen.
government, right? So that's the thing, is like, I think the whataboutism, I think, and like you brought up a good point. It's always sort of brought up, like the whataboutism, what about this, what about that? But it is quite relevant if we're talking about how do we help other people in other countries. But if we cared about human rights, we would really be talking about what do we do here?
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight the gaslighting of that messaging that Western states perform as well, right? They say that interventionism is due to, trying to uphold our systems of democracy, our values of democracy and human rights and, freedom of speech. And that is always the message that is proposed. But then if you look at actual results, that has rarely ever been achieved. In fact, we often always make things worse. So it's this gaslighting of their own citizens saying we're here to help those other countries, but actually in practice that's clearly not the agenda because that's never at the forefront. And then also there are always a lot more obvious commercial interests, capitalist interests that are at play, right? Or geopolitical interests that are at play that are much more evident because, to your point, then, if it was really about all those things, then why are we only targeting regions or countries where politically they're perceived as a threat or politically they actually have resources that are advantageous to the corporations that operate within Western countries? So I think, we to challenge them on their efficacy in helping destabilize regions that they've destabilized, restabilize, I think is honestly not even the point that they're trying to make, right? It's like, actually, we can condemn them for that, but actually they don't really care about that. And that's just what they want us to talk about and to focus on versus the arms deals that they make, versus the, ignoring Saudi Arabia and all of the questionable things that with solid evidence, right, that they're doing to its own citizens. So I think the sooner we accept that it's not actually about caring about those other citizens, the sooner we'll stop wasting our breath in calling it out, because I don't think the US or the UK are actually interested in any of that.
Yeah, I mean, it is preposterous to suddenly care so much about the Muslims in Xin Jiang. Like all of a sudden, the US cares so much about Muslims. It sort of beggars belief. But people do that over and over again. And I mean, I do listen to quite a few US media outlets, news outlets, and they just cannot say China without saying genocide. It's like now it's just such a given. Yeah, so the other report that we both read is the Xin Jiang report from Italy. Mm-hmm. So let's back up a little bit and talk about in what places do you find that, we've talked about the evolution of our own xenophobia. How and where, where did you start? What changed that? And where are you now?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I've always been politically or interested in geopolitics for whatever reason since I was a teenager, and was quite argumentative as a child as well. And I think it's definitely been a part of now we're having a more personal conversation, right, about my personal identity growing up. I think it's not just xenophobia, right, but there's a lot of internalized racism as well, that I think especially British East and Southeast Asians, because we're such a minority, is very different. Right? When I experienced going to the US, right, like you do have a community that's already there, and there's ways that you can develop that. But here, and from what I've been hearing as well from other East and Southeast Asian people that I've met in the UK, is that you are often one or two of the only East or Southeast Asian people in your town or your school. So growing up with that, and also the whole model minority myth, right, you do really want to make your Asianness as invisible as possible. And especially when I was younger, on the path of righteousness, right, everything, and I wanted to be a lawyer, so anything human rights related, right, was immediately something that I would have an opinion on or be interested in.
And you grew up in Scotland?
I grew up in Scotland, yeah. And then it's interesting because like my parents would often complain about xenophobia in news reporting in media, like in the BBC News or something they would see online. And then we would have not like arguments, but I would definitely say, like, wow, CCP are evil and all this stuff, there's no human rights. And they're just parroting, right, what you see in the mainstream media. And I think at that time as well, I did very little to question the intentions of mainstream media, right? And I think even now, especially now, there's this disconnect between what supposedly liberal news outlets are putting out versus actual reality, and the fact that I don't think we can really describe any mainstream media as liberal or remotely progressive in the US or the UK. So so there's definitely a lot of just parroting what I thought was liberal media. Right, well, they must be objective, it's the BBC, and then obviously just through learning about or reframing my own identity, honestly, and that's taken a lot of work, which it always does, I think, for East and Southeast Asians. So doing a lot of work, recognizing my own internalized racism, internalized xenophobia, just being a lot more critical over the last few years of everything I've been seeing, especially as I think me and a lot of people have become much more politically aware, or at least trying to figure out this way of living is really not working for most of us. Why is it not working? And then kind of really understanding the root of that, and then not seeing that reflected in mainstream media at all, right? Mm-hmm. Having to rely on alternate news sources, having to rely on independent journalists, having to rely on Twitter or Instagram for real objective information. So applying that lens to everything, I think, is important. So it's not about, we're talking about China right now, and hopefully people can apply some of the things that we've learned to China, but really it's not about just China, right? It's about how the lens that we use to approach all issues that we think are issues or things that we want to try and help solve.
Yeah, to me, it's not, apart from, yes, being ethnically Chinese, having been to China several times, many times in my life, etc., it's not this push against propaganda is not about China, because it's the thing that disturbs me the most. And like you said, I'm a little older than you, so the Iraq War, the second one, I mean the 9/11 one, I think that was for me the first. When I saw George Bush's speech on the Beacon of Freedom, it just so rang not true to me. And I think that was the first time in my life that I was suddenly really like, oh, CNN, BBC, these are not trusted sources. Yeah, suddenly I was like reading the New York Times and going, this is so biased, the way they've reported this. Yeah. So that was probably for me like the beginning. And it's just the thing that's so frustrating about it is that it's just ramped up to like 100, it feels like, with China. Maybe that's my own sensitivity, thinking it has been ramped up, but there's such a lack of even conversation around, like, for example, the Xin Jiang thing. It's like, it's just a given that China is genocidal, so there's no pushback at all. I mean, apart from this Italian report, and then there was a Swedish report before that, there's just been no real reporting on this issue, even though, like, what was interesting about this report, the Italian one, was that it's not even like they pick out certain things that I should know. For example, the second letter to UNCHR, or something like that. The UN saying that 23 Muslim countries are going against the American claims of genocide against China.
Yeah,
and I mean, kind of knew that, but
yeah, I think that part is where like my cynicism on state-led statements or comments on this, I draw a limit there, right? Because it's I think Saudi Arabia, Turkey, those countries, Erdogan, right, from Turkey, defending right China's policies and saying that all Uyghurs in China can live peacefully. And for someone who has such a horrible track record of human rights in his own country,
and also is quite aligned with the US, so that's kind of strange to me why
so
they
like
come out.
So a ringing endorsement from countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, who also have, economic ties to China or economic interests in China. I personally don't take too much stock into that, because I don't think that those countries typically care about Muslims in other countries, right? The way that they also exploit, Muslims from other countries in their own countries. So, to me, that's a little bit hollow, but absolutely, I mean, to contextualize, right? Because, if you're going to bring up, or if an article or if someone's going to bring up, how all these Western countries are, saying that it's happening.
50.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Then it's relevant to bring that up. Absolutely. But as a defense of China, I think, questionable. And yeah, I think maybe just to pause on the Uyghur issue in China, I think it's valid that the Italian report claims that they found zero evidence of forced labor, zero evidence of actual genocide, whether it's culturally or physically. I think that is accurate, because there hasn't been any evidence of any of those things, nothing concrete, right? Even if you go really looking for the sources of that information, it's just not there. But I think, as with everything, right? So with China's one-child policy, with China's movement to, or actions to liberate people out of poverty, and also this is the Uyghur situation is also part of China's war on terror, right? It's obviously going to have incidents of abuse, incidents of corruption, incidents where people are mistreated. So if we look at the one-child policy, like in the cities, quite well actioned, adopted, you would get a fine, right, if you were found to have, more than one child. And then, and they made exceptions for, I think at least most of the ethnic minorities that do exist in China. But that's not to say that that policy rolled out across billions of people was uniformly great and without issues, right? There were definitely actual cases of forced sterilization, and again, in rural areas where it's very difficult to make sure that things are implemented without corruption. As far as I'm aware, those incidents where it was possible were addressed, and that's not to say, though, right, that it was a great policy and that it was carried out perfectly.
That would be more against the Han population, would have the one child, because they're not an ethnic minority. It wouldn't be extended to the Uyghurs, so that's kind of interesting.
Well, I think for the other ethnic minorities, I think they were allowed 2, so there was still a restriction. But it's I
think it's some more. So really depending on the population. So for sure. And I think in terms of talking about this as like a genocidal thing, it is really important to look at the evidence of why is it that nobody can even talk about it without accusations of being a genocide denier. Like that's kind of the problem, rather than, of course, we're going to have issues in China, that I think really bringing it back to this Western imperial mindset is the, we don't, it's the business of Chinese people that live there, like it really, they need to sort that out. Like we have to sort of accept that other countries also have great intellectuals that are capable of thinking and
and it's again, it's like infantilization, right? And
exactly.
And it also obscures our ability to actually get real reporting out of Xinjiang or out from Uyghurs that are on the ground. I've heard anecdotally that yes, of course, there's been forced like imprisonment, or at least being forced to go into these camps and being forced to do certain things. And I'm sure there are instances of like assault that happen, right, in these institutions, and any situation where you're told that you're above and beyond like people that you're looking after is not great, right? So then, but these are obscured or not able to be reported on because of the focus on these really baseless reports that are actually coming out.
So it actually like undermines any effort for real human rights, right? But also, I think going back to that point that you made of the war on terror, I think that's where the whataboutism really is important, because it is like not all countries, we're all kind of like involved in the war on terror, in some way. And so but the UK and the US have a very different approach to it than China. And that's what should be compared when we're talking about the Uyghur situation, really, right?
And there's definitely so much to be said about how the Western war on terror has been an absolute abject failure. And I think we can't really do that without, because it's not like the US and the UK had all the best intentions and they just really messed up on the execution, right? Because they didn't understand the culture of the region and they didn't know, like, that's not what happened, right? There was a concerted effort to essentially, strip that region of autonomy and resources and divide up things from a military standpoint as well, and to increase essentially Western influence, right, in that region. And then if we look at all the economic benefits of the Xinjiang region and what it brings to China, and and in the reporting, right, in the Italian reporting, it talks about the importance of Xinjiang as a hub for all sorts of logistical and political and economic reasons.
Initiative.
Yeah, exactly. So that context, I think, is often left behind, whereas those considerations are often at the forefront of why governments make decisions and policies that they do.
So what you're saying is that the Xinjiang being a really strategic region, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, means two things. One, that the US may have a vested interest, and the UK, whatever, may have a vested interest in destabilizing that region. And the other one is China may actually have a vested interest in stabilizing and alleviating poverty in that region, because it's such a strategic and important part of the Belt and Road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the Western war on terror and its quote unquote failures, I think at a human level, of course, but at the strategic level overall for the US,
right.
Obviously there's massive human cost on the US side as well. But on the strategic side, was it a failure? I don't know. I don't.
Thinking about this in two ways. One is like, yes, it seems to be very successful for Theon and
Raytheon, yep.
Yes, all these people, and yes, no doubt they're a huge influence in American politics. So yes, it was very successful for them. But strategically, do you see it as successful? Like, how is it successful for America?
I just think that this perpetual machine of destabilization is just overall, if you think about the propaganda, right, that the US can use and will continue to use, right? Think of how the war veterans have been used politically throughout the last 20 years or even longer, right? The second Iraq War, how the attacks were used to create the Patriot Act, amongst other, a lot of legislation, right? That really infringe on privacy and human rights of US citizens. Think of like the NSA listening in on people's conversations, in the US. Think of all of the policies that they were able to create on the back of this situation, the way that they've been able to capitalize on people's fears, people's sentiments. So I think beyond the arms industry, I think politically and in kind of the US imperialist machine agenda, I think it's actually done a great job of, because it's the same way, right? Like, you have to support the military, you can't say anything negative about that.
True.
It's being used to justify an ever increasing military spending, military budget as well. And then, and also I think it's shown the government in the US and the UK that they can engage in wars with zero public kind of support. Now it's kind of almost easier for them to, or in a way, well, they're trying to make it as easy as they can, right, with the kind of xenophobic coverage and propaganda, to make it as easy as they can to justify any sort of action against China. I think it's been a net positive in terms of their ability to manipulate the situation for their own benefit, to gaslight us into not really seeing the situation for what it is, and continues to pave the way. I mean, it's also not a new blueprint. They've done similar things to every other country, right, in South America, Central America. So I think it's just a continuation, and I honestly don't see, again, massive human impact, right, massive human toll, but in terms of their imperialism and in terms of the military industrial complex, I think it's been a great win for them.
A great success. And Yeah, and you're right too, like because it's such a great success, and it's such a sophisticated machine, I guess. It is like it is true that we're often wondering, well, what happened to the anti-war left,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah,
in the West.
and on if this strategy didn't work for them, right? If they felt like it was a failure on the political messaging front too, then they won't be using the exact same tactics now against China than that they did 20 years ago, right? For the war in Iraq. Like it's the same playbook.
Right.
And I think we're obviously sensitive to it, but it's very, very clear fake news essentially, right? Propaganda, paint them as the enemy, as someone that we need to crush, or we need to, just because ideologically, they're against what we're about. So, right, if they didn't feel like that was successful, then why use the
Right.
same playbook? And it's, I think, already working. So,
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also think that, like, with conversations with some family members, etc., it always strikes me as strange that, you can say so many times, you can just keep repeating that the US has 400 military bases surrounding China. China has one in Djibouti. That's it. And that was like to do with UN corporations. It's a completely different scenario. And yet when I have conversations with certain family members, it's still like, but the South China Sea and China's a bully. And it's like, well, I mean, even if China was a bully, like why is it not entering the conversation that America's a bigger bully with all their 400 military bases? The internalized xenophobia, or not even internalized, but it's the xenophobia that is apparent in Asia, as opposed to, like, I think it's easier to believe that stuff if you're in the US and you've just never been to Asia, you've never been to China, you know what I mean? You're not Chinese, perhaps, whatever. I sort of understand that more, but I think, like, when you're in Southeast Asia and you're still affected by these narratives, that's really fascinating to me too.
mm-hmm.
And just shows how effective it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've been talking about like whataboutism and what it is and isn't. And I think it's not whataboutism when what we're bringing up actually adds valuable context where we're discussing, right? So
Right.
it's not about saying China is not aggressive or a bully towards other countries in the region. Like, of course it can be, and it has been. They do sanctions too, right? And they do kind of propaganda condemnations, right? So it's not to say that that's not happening, or it's not to direct the conversation away from that, but it's to say, well, are we also recognizing the same issues in the West? And if we're not, then that's a problem, right? Because then if it's being used to justify force against China, or to start a proxy war, because I feel like, it's not going to be outright war between the US and China, right? Because,
Right.
those citizens are too valuable. Let's fight this out somewhere else, where, people are less likely going to care about those bodies. So, so it's like, if you don't actually then recognize where that rhetoric is coming from, then we're going to be blindly going down the road of actual escalation for something more violent. So I think that's why it's important to contextualize, because then it's very easy to be swept up, right, in that ongoing narrative.
But to go back, I don't know did we actually talk about the catalyst for you changing your mind from xenophobia? Like, xenophobia? Did we, or did we just sort of get?
I think it was honestly like a gradual evolution in, the more that I understood where I was critical about my own identity, and kind of understanding where that came from, and then actually understanding that was external and that was cultural because of growing up in the West, understanding that at the same time as just being just generally more critical of the things that I was consuming. I think that just in combination was like, oh, holy shit. Wait,
Right.
and then I think, because, like I said, I continue to have conversations with my own family about, their lived experiences in China, and also, my parents' opinions, right, as people who emigrated in their like late 20s. And have been here now for the most part of their life versus being China. But, I was born in 1989, the same year that Tiananmen Square happened.
Right.
So my parents are very close to that situation, and close to what happened after. My dad is coming to the UK as a result of Deng Xiaoping's policy in, opening up China. But he was also the one that directed the soldiers to pull the trigger on, in June that year. So it's been very interesting talking to them about that context, and and there's nuance there, right, in that. So so I think as I've tried to be more nuanced about everything else that I've been consuming, luckily also apply to things on China and reporting there as well.
That is interesting. I mean, and also just so do you go back to China quite regularly? Like, when was the last time you went back?
Every few years, sometimes, once every few years, and then sometimes many years have passed without me realizing that I haven't gone back yet. I mean, I definitely do try to understand Chinese citizens' opinions as and when I meet them, because I think it's really interesting.
Anything that's surprising to you, like really different?
I think people definitely have different priorities over there, and I think it's interesting because one thing that I noticed, kind of like unrelated, but there's no religious morality, right? So there's no concept of religion morality as it applies to, I think, laws out west, right? Like, we're constantly having to fight against religious morality in terms of women's bodies or people's bodies, or our ability to love who we love. That all comes from fighting against I would say, religious dogma. Whereas in China, obviously there's homophobia, obviously there's discrimination, but it's not from a religiously dogmatic place.
Where's that from?
And then the racism as well, obviously. It's I think a lot of it, some of it is stemmed from just ignorance. And then, but the CCP is also notoriously anti-feminist as well.
But that's so bizarre. Why is it anti-feminist when the whole communist, that really famous, women hold up half of the sky.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting because that is something that is brought up a lot. But I think especially capitalist influences, and it's still, you can't remove 5,000 years of patriarchal conditioning.
I mean, the idea of finding your feet, that's just that was a common practice amongst, I guess, upper class.
Yeah, and Mao, people like to say Mao got rid of that, and blah blah. But well, if you look at the CCP, right, there's no women in any senior positions at all. I think it's a little bit better on the kind of commercial side, actually. There's a lot more female managers or CEOs in China, but that's still
there are female politicians, but they're just not
no senior members though.
They're not senior members, and they're I think it's what is it, a third or a quarter, so not equal.
And the CCP also, they have an idea of people's roles, right? They have an idea of what citizens' roles should be, what their role should be. So they also have ideas about what women citizens' roles should be, and it's unfortunately getting married.
Well, especially now, if we consider that disproportionate population, right? There's still much more men than women. So if the women don't want to get married, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so where you are now, it's just really nuance and truth. I mean, that's what I feel. Once you start focusing on truth, you have to have nuance. It's impossible.
Yeah, and I think also not getting. Yeah, I think even though we can aspire to be truth-seeking and to be nuanced, I think though there are still going to be places where we get stuck, or places where we feel personally invested in an outcome, or personally invested in a narrative. So I think it's always important to recognize that. But then it's honestly more to the point of what we're saying, right? It's it's not about us getting on a soapbox to condemn or to educate or to say. It's really more about these are things that we're ingesting, internalizing, and then they're having discussions about, right? So it's what is the way what is a way to do that that's actually helpful, both for ourselves
Yeah.
internally and in the conversations that we're having.
Yeah, because I do find myself, not after having researched it, the Xin Jiang thing, but I didn't believe it when it was first presented to me. You know, it's just like the Hong Kong protest. That's the first instinct, is to believe the Western narrative, because that's what I grew up with. And so it's just so much harder for me to sort of wade into it and like try to push back against my assumptions. That's the only thing we can do. Although I do feel a little disheartened by your by your analysis that the propaganda is working. It's very successful for the US and imperialist powers. And I don't know how we push back against that, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's working in the sense that it's difficult to counter that narrative if there's just no narrative that exists outside of it, right? Like, you know, when in our research, right, in having this conversation, I'm sure we both read a lot of articles and try to get different sources, and in doing that it was impossible, honestly, to find any sort of even additional reporting to like the Italian report, right, that was a different perspective. And like, I think in a lot of the major publications I saw mentioning of this report, but it was very much framed in, you know, well, and they say that, you know, there's no evidence, but, you know, it was one article that said it was well documented, which doesn't mean true, right? You can well document something that's false as well.
Yeah, I tried to read the report on the initial Xin Jiang genocide reports or whatever, and that's just, it's not, I mean, it's just not, the ones that I've been able to find, it's not credible. The way that they're always sort of like referencing people who said this thing, and it always comes down to the same people. There's but the burden of proof is on the people, surely, that are making the accusation of genocide, because it's such a huge accusation. I think that's what's sort of missing in the Western conversation about it. It's such a huge accusation. To say it as if it's fact, and then anyone who questions it is a genocide denier, is so insane as well.
Yeah.
Like, that's gaslighting as well.
Yeah, and it's you know, well-worn tactics, right? Like, it's the same similar situation, right? If we, you know, when people have been talking about situation in Palestine and how we can support Palestinians, right? And then any discussion of that,
anti-Semitic immediately.
Immediately was anti-Semitism, and then which also ironically increases incidence of anti-Semitism in those discussions as well. So, you know, there's good reason for people to be sensitive about that, but yeah, it's just not genuine, right? It's very disingenuous. And then, so I think when we come at it, or when normal people come at it, ordinary people come at it from an approach of, well, I just want something objective. I just want to understand, you know, what's going on. And them not really having any of the resources to be able to do that. And I think it's partly easy. It's really easy because of this continued, you know, xenophobia that hasn't ever gone away. Obviously, it's been heightened in the last, you know, 18 months or so. But actually, I was watching a video the other day that said, you know, back in like 1066 or something, you know, there was xenophobia from the Roman Catholic Church. Essentially, they you know, when the Christians were going in their crusades, you know, to Jerusalem or kind of further east, you know, they were coming into contact with the Chinese Empire, and then, you know, their reasoning was, or like their explanation was, well, you know, there's no reason why this culture can be so advanced, or there's no reason why these people can be so have such a rich, strong culture. It must be because of magic or aliens or, you know, something sinister, right? Black magic. So like this like idea of like Eastern Orientalism, mysticism, you know, suspicious, mysterious ways of a culture being is actually so deep ingrained, like even longer than I think what we actually realize. So they don't have to put out anything that's, you know, researched or with due diligence, right? If you think about the BuzzFeed article that won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism last year, Yeah, it was
What was it about?
it was about the Uyghur situation in China. And the journalists did not visit China at all.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
You
they
think that
did.
would be important?
They also quoted that Zan's guy, right? The one that has
Adrian
been
Zenz.
Adrian Zenz, sorry, yeah. They
Mhm.
quoted Adrian Zenz as one of their main sources.
But he's never been to Xin Jiang either.
No, and he's already been repeatedly discredited.
Right.
So yeah, so I think in the kind of society that we're in now, right, you just don't need to do any due diligence. You don't need to to have a well-informed argument for people
Right.
to believe you, unfortunately. And I think again, it's not just about China, right? It's the way that we react to what we see across the board. So yeah, unfortunately, I just think they are aware of that, you know, and like it reminds me a lot of actually about the way you know, I think that the state and the media kind of cue things up, right? Cue up the escalation. So you know, if we think about kind of unrelated now, but the whole critical race theory debate that
Right.
happened in the States, right? Where you know they were able to politically drum up a frenzy about something that wasn't taught in schools, isn't planned to be taught in schools. There's no real, yeah, there's no, I think maybe there are some states that we're talking about making sure that they talk about race more in the curriculum, but you know, there was no concerted actual campaign to teach critical race theory in schools, but they were able to drum up such a frenzy in the media and you know, in those states where it really mattered, where then they were able to pass legislation to basically, in Texas, right, to basically say we don't have to teach anything about Martin Luther King, we don't have to teach anything about civil rights, we don't have to teach about slavery because it makes us uncomfortable. So it's this progression and the way that they tee things up, right? So I feel like it's very similar. You know, they're teeing up our fear and you know, our kind of aggression against China, so that they can follow up with, I mean, they already have, right, with sanctions, and then with, I think, further escalations as the narrative continues.
Yeah, and it's like what you said about CRT. It's like there was no actual discussion of what it was exactly. Like it was just more about, you know, racism is such a, it's a term that's so scary to people. So once you introduce those, there's specific terms, genocide, racism, anti-Semitism, anything like that, you introduce to a conversation, there's suddenly no discussion around it. Like you can't, on the mainstream media, there's suddenly no discussion around those topics.
Yeah, it
So
creates a
it's
massive
super
chilling
effective.
effect. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's similarly, right, that conversation and internally within the Labour Party, right? It was a very very great way to silence any sort of calls to actually let's think about, you know, what we're actually saying here. And then similarly as well, right, there were horrific incidents of Islamophobia, real incidents recorded, well documented, actual real incidents of Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, and I'm sure within the Labour Party too. But you know, that is never called into question, that is never investigated, right? Because we've created this atmosphere where xenophobia, where Islamophobia is acceptable and deserved. And you know,
and xenophobia as well, actually. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. It's in the same way. And then yeah, and it's also interesting as well, because I think the case of that young woman, I can't remember her name is, has come up now again, because she's so she was groomed, right, by ISIS, and she left the UK when she was 15.
Yeah, I can't remember her name. And is she allowed back? That whole conversation about that.
Yeah, so you know, she recently appeared on, I think, TV to apologize to the whole country about being coercively, you know, brought to another country where she was actually also sexually assaulted. So for me, it's like we're condemning China for Islamophobia that we can't even prove, and this country is actively being Islamophobic against its own citizen and citizens, right? You know, she was a naturalized citizen, and you know, I'm a naturalized citizen in the UK. So at what point, right, are we going to decide that China is such a threat that any Chinese born nationals get to be denaturalized because of their opinions essentially. I mean, obviously she did a bit more than that, but I think contextually, you know, it's why not have compassion for someone who was clearly in a very coercive situation. So I think the hypocrisy is just mind-blowing, and I think it's still relevant to talk about Islamophobia, because that hasn't gone away, right? In the last 20 years since the war, Islamophobia has shot, I think it shot up like 200%, and then just stayed that way consistently over the last 20 years. So, you know, I think it's important that we still try to tackle Islamophobia now, because it's still like a massive issue, especially in the UK, in this country, and also highlight the fact that, we see similar trends now in terms of xenophobia.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Do you have anything else that you would like to add? Quite a wide-ranging one.
Yeah, I think hopefully it's, the way that we've discussed it, I think hopefully we're just encouraging more people to be not necessarily skeptical, but I guess less reactive, you know, to what we see.
I think skeptical is fair, because you do need to be skeptical about like everything that we're reading, right? It's usually like 10 outlets reporting on, like we said, like one article, and then that article hasn't been fact checked properly, not the fake fact checking sort of thing. And so it proliferates, and because you're gonna get, like, that's a thing, when usually it would be like, oh, okay, check your secondary sources, right? But in this case, you could check like 10 sources and they're all quoting from the same thing. Yeah. So that's the problem.
I think skepticism without, in any
Cynicism?
context, I think skepticism without any sort of qualification is also bad, right? Because you can also be skeptical about other people's lived experiences. You can be skeptical about things that you personally disagree with, to a level where it's not actually healthy, or it's not actually helpful for you to find the truth, if that makes sense. So I think for me, it's about not immediately reacting to a piece of news, or not immediately reacting to something. And then I think, recognizing the danger of subscribing to kind of Western imperialist narratives. We do such a bad job of contextualizing the things that we see in the West, right, in terms of how it's all interconnected, right? So kind of thematically, as we've been discussing, we find it really easy to see Chinese propaganda for what it is, right? To call out misinformation from the CCP, to call out, you know, abuses of human rights from the CCP. Like, they happen, right? There's documented cases of that, you know, political prisoners, like the situation in Hong Kong. We can absolutely recognize those for what they are, as dangerous, and, you know, clearly against its own citizens. But we do not apply the same lens to clearly institutional issues that happen in the UK and the US and other Western countries, right? We chalk those down to, you know, individual acts of violence, or we chalk those down to, well, isn't just an education thing, or it's like, oh, it's just a cultural thing. Like, no, there are systematic issues, there are systematic threads that run through these situations that we need to recognize. And then, because without recognizing it, it's very hard to dismantle it, or to actually tackle things at the root, right? If we say, and I think this kind of just maybe brings it back nicely, right? If we say that this country and the US, right, that we are committed to anti-racism, that we don't believe that the violence against the Asian community is warranted, and, like, you know, if we believe that, you know, we should stop that, then if we really believe that, and we really want to sort it out at the root, then it is also on us to recognize where institutions are, like the media and the state, are, you know, promoting xenophobia, and to recognize that within ourselves, and to recognize that when it's happening, and to understand that, yes, there is a imperialist agenda that is just really not discussed. And I think even saying it like that, I think a lot of people are like, oh my God, you know, that's so serious. Like, you know, you're talking like Darth Vader type.
Actually, like a lot of these articles that I read on The Guardian and the BBC, when they try to discredit someone, they call them anti-imperialists as a criticism.
Oh my God.
It's very interesting, especially around the reporting of Syria, you know, like the chemical weapons and how that's just been debunked, you know. But so that stuff, that's the funny thing, is that they're actually very clear on the imperialist agenda in a way, but because it's never discussed, it's not considered a bad thing, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I think anytime we see a group of people that may be oppressed, right, in other regions, I think obviously it's important that we should care about it, because I also believe that I think any individual group struggle is separate, right? Like we do live in a very globalized world now. I believe that the functions of the state, and especially the instruments of the state, like the police or the army, I think a lot of them serve very similar functions across the world, regardless of what government is in power, right? I think we often see police being utilized to enforce property rights and to also brutalize its own citizens. I really don't see police used in any other way in most countries, in most states. This is not to say that we can't have an opinion, or that we shouldn't care about things that are the struggles of other places. In fact, I think there's a lot of commonality in our struggles, but it's finding what practical ways you can actually help, which is very limited, I think, honestly.
I think it is very limited, but that does make me, you're talking about the police made me think about the report in China again, because one of the funny things that I don't think it was in this report, but it was in someone else's account of China and their relationship to the police being very different from ours, where it's like they can call the police and be like, the electrical's not working in my apartment, which is such a different mindset.
Yeah, but there's also situations where the police ask to invite you for tea, and that means they want to have a conversation about your political activities and how you should not do that again if you don't want to be disappeared. So yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of
differences.
Huge scale there.
I mean, I think if we're thinking about what practical things that we can do, right? I think we obviously, especially in Western societies, we do have some influence over the state, right, into the decisions that they make and into the policies that we have.
I think like talking about the UK, at least, like I guess maybe in Scotland, do you feel more hopeful?
I think there's some, right? I mean, look, if that vote to say that there's genocide occurring in China, right? I think if a lot of people wrote to their MPs to say that they disagreed with that vote, then maybe it would have gone a different way. So I don't
know. I mean, I was with Wapiao that we interviewed, he did try to create a campaign around that, but like you're right, there are a few things. They announced it on Thursday, they had it on like Wednesday, so there's not enough to really like gather everybody up. So so there's stuff like that. But I did find that when I emailed my MP, you just gotta like a cut and paste generic response, where it's so clear they didn't read your email, and then they're just like they're like agreeing with you while saying it's like you know what I mean. It's just a cut and paste. Yeah. They see Xin Jiang, they say genocide. They don't actually even read that you're saying it's not genocide.
Yeah, and this is not the time and place to compel people to have a revolution or anything like that. But I think the more interactions that we have with our politicians that result in being dismissed or being brushed off, or like not feeling like we've been heard, right? Because we don't live in a direct democracy. We outsource all of our decision making to these elected officials, which I think has kind of gone it's gone to an extent where we actually don't feel invested in any of the decisions that they make. So I think the more interactions that we have where we're recognizing that there's massive limitations to what they can do and in terms of what they'll actually listen to as well, then I think that's an opportunity for us to think about, well, what are the alternatives? Why do we not live in a direct democracy? Why do we have a system where in the UK and the US, right, it's just a two-party system that doesn't actually work for anyone? So for me, that's much bigger and that's much more impactful than pressuring our government right now to like either create sanctions or lift sanctions into other
pressuring our government that we don't trust to look out for our well-being to sanction another country them for the well-being of their people.
Yeah, figure out how
really unlikely.
figure out how they can work for us first.
Right. Yeah.
And notice the ways that they're obviously not working for us, and then thinking of ways to change that. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. And like you said, like hopefully our own vulnerabilities or expressions of vulnerabilities around this subject, you know, it's just like an encouragement for more discussion and self-reflection. So.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
The Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity is available as a podcast on Spotify and Amazon Music.
You can also like and subscribe to our videos on YouTube. And if you want to help us grow, then you can become a patron on Patreon. And that's it, right? I think that's it.
Yeah.